This video is made possible by Vincero Watches, luxury handcrafted watches at fair prices. You can check them out through the link below. Which historical figure springs to mind when you hear the words "the last king of the French"? We're guessing it's probably Louis XVI, the long-haired fop who lost his head in the French Revolution. But what if we told you that the story of France's kings didn't end with the guillotine slicing through Louis's neck in 1793? What if we told you that France didn't say goodbye to its last king until over 50 years later? Well, it's time you met that king. Louis-Philippe was a man whose life turned on revolution. Born into an aristocratic family, he survived the First French Revolution that killed his father, only to become king in yet another revolution that toppled his father's cousin. As a figurehead of the July monarchy, he survived rebellions and Napoleonic coups before losing everything when the streets of Paris once more rose up, this time against him. A lifelong liberal who became a dictator king, an exile who grew up to rule the nation that exiled him. This is the complex, fascinating life story of Louis-Philippe, the last king of the French. In the early hours of October 6, 1789, fate handed the teenage Louis-Philippe a front-row seat to history. The previous evening, a huge mob of women had gathered in Paris and set off for Versailles, the opulent palace of King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. It was the early days of the French Revolution. Not 3 months before, the Bastille had fallen, and now here Louis-Philippe was, leaning out of a window on a cool October night, as the women of Paris forcibly dragged the king and his family back to the capital. Watching the procession of women passing below, Louis-Philippe had good reason to be scared. He was the eldest son of the Duc d'Orléans. The captured king was his first cousin once removed. But 16-year-old Louis-Philippe, he wasn't scared. He was already planning to ride this wave of revolution to greatness. Born on October 6, 1773, Louis-Philippe had what you might describe as an unusual upbringing. His father, the Duc d'Orléans, was obsessed with social experimentation. While other royal children were learning the basics of ruling, Louis-Philippe and his siblings were contemplating strenuous physical tasks while reciting Jean-Jacques Rousseau. This meant a childhood that left the boy in excellent physical and mental shape, and the father with a reputation as a very unroyal royal. This reputation, it turned out to be useful when the French Revolution hit. While other aristocrats fled into exile, the Duke was elected to the Revolutionary National Assembly, changing his name to Philippe Égalité. So when teenage Louis-Philippe witnessed the 1789 Women's March from our cold open, he didn't panic. Instead, he joined the Jacobin Club. That's the same Jacobin Club Robespierre came from, and he also enrolled in the French army. As France went to war with Austria in 1792, Louis-Philippe found himself soaring up the ranks, eventually becoming attached to the staff of General Dumouriez. At this stage, it might have seemed like the revolution was a godsend for the Orléans family. In January of 1793, the Duke, or Philippe Égalité, or whatever you want to call him, he voted alongside the National Assembly to execute his cousin, Louis XVI. But this was just the family's high point. Like a roller coaster cart approaching the top of a peak, the only way for the Orléans clan now was down. In April of 1793, Louis-Philippe discovered General Dumouriez was plotting a coup. While he didn't join the plot, he also didn't report it, which became pretty awkward when the coup was uncovered. As General Dumouriez and his fellow plotters fled to Austria, Louis-Philippe was forced to flee alongside them. Suddenly, the Orléans name was synonymous with counter-revolution. Back in Paris, the Committee of Public Safety arrested the entire family. That November, Philippe Égalité was guillotined. Louis-Philippe was hiding in Switzerland when he got the news that his father was dead and that he now was the Duke of Orléans. For the rest of his life, he would blame himself for his father's death. The next few years were a turbulent time in Europe. While Louis-Philippe traveled the continent under an assumed name, in France the Thermidorian reaction ended the reign of terror and sent Robespierre to the guillotine. In the place of the revolutionary government, the Directory rose up. It was their agents who finally tracked Louis-Philippe to Denmark in 1796. The Directory wasn't as vicious as Robespierre's goon squad. However, they did not want an Orléans running around Europe, especially now exiled Orleanists were plotting to put the new Duke on the French throne. So they decided to make Louis-Philippe an offer he couldn't refuse. Get out of Europe and we won't guillotine the rest of your family. And that was how the future French king Louis-Philippe, he wound up going to America. Despite the Directory's fears, Louis-Philippe, he wasn't much of a threat. When Orleanists started plotting to overthrow the Directory and make him king, the new duke was super clear that he wanted nothing to do with this harebrained scheme. That may be why, in 1800, he was finally able to make peace with the Comte d'Artois. The Comte was the younger brother of Louis XVI. He had fled into exile with his older brother, Louis XVIII, right after the revolution exploded, and he was now living in England. When Louis-Philippe joined the Comte after a couple of years in America, the Comte had every reason to hate the Orleans name. Remember, the last duke had voted for his brother's execution. The Comte's living brother, Louis XVIII, was even convinced that the entire revolution had been an Orleanist plot. But this was 1800. The Directory had now fallen. With the situation in France in flux, the Comte was determined that the royal family rebuild their bridges. So despite Louis XVIII being all like, well, dude, no, the Comte invited Louis-Philippe back into the fold. Not that this reconciliation had much real-world effect. By the time the family made up, Napoleon Bonaparte was firmly in control of France, and no one was clamoring for a royal return. That was pretty much it for the next decade. While Napoleon did his thing, conquering everything in sight, Louis-Philippe potted around London doing whatever it is that kings do in exile, before he moved to Sicily to marry Marie Antoinette's niece. And really, his story, it kind of could have ended there were it not for 1812. 1812 is the year that Napoleon made the classic dictator mistake of invading Russia. As his army and empire disintegrated around him, it began to look like Napoleon wouldn't be leading France for very much longer. All of this, it raised a potent question. Who would? As the Allies marched into Paris in April of 1814, it wasn't clear who would get the restored French throne. While Louis XVIII was the obvious choice, there was a powerful Orleanist movement in parts of French society that wanted Duke to be king. It didn't help that Louis-Philippe kept quiet right until the last second when he finally declared for Louis XVIII. Some think that the Duke was cajoled into this by the Comte. More likely, though, the Allies had a bit of a quiet word with him. Something like, dude, we do not need you screwing up our post-Napoleon plans by starting a civil war, yo. Anyway, Louis-Philippe's late support for Louis XVIII definitely was not wholehearted. During the 100 Days when Napoleon escaped Elba and returned to France, Louis-Philippe lurked around Paris looking for all the world like someone waiting to snatch the throne when Napoleon inevitably fell again. After Waterloo, when Louis XVIII was restored for the second time, Louis-Philippe began lavishing gifts and patronage upon liberals, looking for all the world like someone trying to fashion himself as an attractive alternative king. But the clearest indication we have about the Duke's ambitions came in September of 1820. Earlier that year, the Comte d'Artois' surviving son had been assassinated. With his death, Louis-Philippe had become third in line to the throne. But then it turned out that the dead man had impregnated his wife before dying. 7 months later, she gave birth to their child, Henri, and just like that, Louis-Philippe was out of the running for king. The news of the miracle baby gave Louis-Philippe a breakdown. He reportedly collapsed when the news reached him, wailing that Orleans would now never amount to anything. It was a touch melodramatic, and it was also untrue. Nobody at that time had any way of knowing it, but Louis-Philippe was just one good revolution away from becoming king. On September 16th, 1824, Louis XVIII passed away. In his place, the Comte d'Artois assumed the French throne under the name Charles X. By this time, Louis-Philippe had more or less given up on being king, becoming instead a big player on the business scene and a friend of the bourgeois liberals in the government's opposition. Thus, the Duke was perfectly placed to see just how quickly France soured on Charles X. Back when Louis XVIII had ascended in 1814, a whole bunch of people in France had basically been like, whoa, time out right now. We don't want another corrupt Louis lording over us with absolute power. That is not cool, right? So, Louis XVIII had signed something called the Charter of 1814, a semi-constitution that basically said, the king shall not act like a gigantic dickhead. Although Louis had thought the charter an outrage, he stood by it out of necessity, realizing that times had changed. But Charles, he didn't get the message. Almost the first thing he did after being coronated was to figuratively bend over and use the charter to wipe his bottom. Under Charles's ministry, freedom of speech, it was axed, capital punishment for religious offenses was revived, and the franchise was restricted until not even the wealthy bourgeois could vote. By 1830, Charles was so close to being a dictator that his advisors actually advised that he launch a royal coup. So he did. On Sunday, July the 25th, 1830, Charles published something known as the Four Ordinances. This outlawed his opposition and also freedom of the press. His government thought it was a masterstroke. The people of Paris, they thought differently. That Monday, the French capital trembled with unrest. There were protests, anti-monarchy chants, the smashing of property. It might have died down of its own accord had Charles not sent in the army to shoot some of the protesters as an example. It was as effective a suicide as if Charles had tied a rock to his neck and dived headfirst into the Seine. The next day, July the 27th, 1830, Paris went up in flames. Across the capital, rioters built barricades and armed themselves. When the soldiers came storming in, firefights erupted. There was carnage. There was blood in the streets. Outmaneuvered by the angry Parisians, the army simply had to abandon the city. As they left, the last thing Charles's soldiers saw was the white flag of the monarchy being torn down and the revolutionary tricolor hoisted in the air. And with that, the July Revolution had begun. So where, you might ask, where was Louis-Philippe? Well, not anywhere really. The future king was holed up at his estate, trying his absolute best not to look like someone waiting around to snatch the throne after Charles was guillotined. It was his liberal opposition friends in Paris who were doing all of the work. As Paris fell to the rioters, the upper bourgeois businessmen and opposition leaders Louis-Philippe surrounded himself with got together and decided that they needed to do something. The July Revolution had caught them all by surprise. They were glad the street fighters of Paris seemed to want tyrannical Charles gone, but were equally terrified the next logical step would be a Robespierre revival group wheeling out the guillotine. So they hatched a plan to make sure that this time the Duc d'Orléans succeeded in his dreams of becoming king. With most of the newspapers on their side, they printed out posters declaring Paris was revolting and that the Duc d'Orléans was the last friend of the people. Then they dispatched an emissary to Louis-Philippe's estate who told him to get his ass to Paris and grab the opportunity that they'd just handed him. Louis-Philippe arrived in Paris just before midnight on Friday, July the 30th, 1830. That same evening, Charles X fled his palace ahead of a lynch mob. Just like that, the king was gone and the French throne was suddenly vacant. Now all Louis-Philippe needed to do was convince the rioters to let him take it. But before we get into all of that, and believe me, it's all worth the wait, I do want to tell you about our fantastic sponsor, Vincero watches. I'm wearing a Vincero right now. This one is a Vincero chronograph. As well as keeping perfect time, it's also got a timer. See these 3 back dials there? They don't just look great, but they also serve a function. Now, I picked out a watch with a blue and silver combination, as you can see, but there are loads of options on their website. You'll be sure to find something that suits your style and your wrist size. I've got small little wrists, so they've got smaller models. One of them fit me perfectly. With summer coming up, I'd also recommend you check out their new Kairos Mesh series. They've got breathable straps, so there's no sweating into it and getting all uncomfortable. And these watches can also be dressed up or dressed down and fit with lots of different styles. Also, all the watch bands on Vincero watches are interchangeable, so you can easily get a new look for your one watch. You can also buy those watch straps separately. Vincero watches believe that luxury isn't about price or specification. It's about detail and craftsmanship, and Vincero watches, they've got a lot of that. Unlike many other watches on the market, Vincero is not about minimalist style. It's more about the classic good look of a watch, which is something I love. Further, by selling direct to the consumer, Vincero can deliver a great watch at a much better price than you might be expecting. To see the full range, go to vincerowatches.com/biographics and use the code biographics on checkout for a special discount. Thanks to Vincero Watches for sponsoring, and let's crack on, shall we? Have you ever had one of those mornings where you wake up, remember what you did last night, and then just immediately curl up into a ball and start screaming? Well, that was Louis-Philippe's morning on July the 31st, 1830. When he realized it just toppled his cousin once removed and willingly rode into the middle of revolutionary Paris, Louis-Philippe had a total meltdown. He actually begged all those liberals who'd dragged him there not to make him king, which must have seemed, well, all sorts of ironic. But there was no way he could back out now. The simple truth was that if someone didn't take this revolutionary bull by the horns, the July Revolution, it wasn't going to stop with Charles. And, well, everyone present had all too real memories of the swish and thunk sound of the guillotine. In the end, Louis-Philippe, he agreed to clear up the mess. Draping himself in the tricolore, he rode out into the raging streets of Paris. Now, this was dangerous. No one in Paris had gone into this revolt because they desperately wanted to replace one doughy king with another royal lardass. By riding out like that, Louis-Philippe was putting himself at real risk of someone screaming, "That guy's a duke! Cut off his head." The reason that this didn't happen is largely thanks to the Marquis de Lafayette. A legendary French hero who'd played a significant role in both the American and original French revolutions, the Marquis was respected by everyone, even Parisian street fighters. When he met Louis-Philippe outside the Hôtel de Ville and enthusiastically embraced him, it sent a clear signal to Paris: the revolution was over. Not that Charles X realized it, though. Still alive, with his head attached to his body, the king was desperately scheming to get his family back onto the throne. The plan he hit on was almost ingenious. The people wanted a new king. Well, he'd give them one. He'd abdicate for his grandson, the miracle baby we mentioned earlier. It was a cunning move that could have saved the Bourbon line. Unfortunately for Charles, though, the idea came too late. As Charles was abdicating, Paris was watching Louis-Philippe and the Marquis de Lafayette waving the tricolore from a balcony, signaling the dawn of a new era. Any thoughts the people of Paris had of allowing another Bourbon to take the throne, it died that very day. On August 9, 1830, Louis-Philippe was crowned. It was agreed beforehand that he would take the title of King of the French, implying a public servant who looked after his people, rather than the traditional title of King of France, which implied a grumpy landlord angry with all of these peasants stinking up the place. It was the moment Louis-Philippe had been waiting for his entire life. 41 years ago, the new King of the French had leaned out of a window and watched as Paris's women marched King Louis XVI back from Versailles. Now, here he was, wearing the crown his long-dead relative had lost to the guillotine. He wasn't just the survivor of two French revolutions. He was the beneficiary. As Charles X fled into exile, the establishment of Louis-Philippe's July monarchy looked a whole lot more like a new chapter in French royal history, one that would establish a new and glorious dynasty. In a way, this was right. It really was a new chapter for France's monarchy, but it was also its last. The July monarchy was popular for maybe about 23 minutes before reality hit. The problem was Louis-Philippe had been put on the throne by a bunch of bourgeois liberals. But the people who'd done all the fighting and dying during that July Revolution, they were workers, and they wanted progress to show for all that bloodshed. Louis-Philippe failed to deliver on this spectacularly. Now, sure, he wasn't anywhere near as autocratic as Charles. More people could vote, freedom of the press was guaranteed, and the government had a healthy opposition. But if you were some unemployed Parisian street fighter, less autocratic than the last guy wasn't exactly what you'd been fighting for. In the first few years of its existence, the July monarchy had to face down all manner of threats. There was a Bonapartist plot to topple Louis-Philippe and put one of Napoleon's relatives on the throne. There was also a legitimist uprising to topple Louis-Philippe and replace him with Charles's grandson. There was also the infamous June Rebellion of 1832, the one Les Miserables is based upon. This Parisian uprising left 800 people dead. Ironically, though, all these attempted revolts actually shored up Louis-Philippe's support. Faced with the prospect of a not great monarch or the workers wheeling out the guillotine, the middle classes always chose the monarchy. But there was one man who saw in the July monarchy not a bulwark against terror, but a golden opportunity. Yep, it's time to welcome into this story our old friend Napoleon III. If you'll no doubt recall, if you saw our previous video about him, Napoleon III was the exiled nephew of the original Napoleon, now living under the insane delusion that he should be Emperor of France. He was also a gigantic pain in Louis-Philippe's derriere. In 1836, when Louis-Philippe was desperately trying to shore up support, Napoleon III launched a tragically inept coup in Strasbourg that succeeded only in embarrassing everyone. When Louis-Philippe tried to return Napoleon I's ashes to France in 1840, Napoleon III was there again, soaking up the limelight by launching yet another coup so incompetent that even anti-Bonapartists felt sorry for him. Unable to deal with the bad publicity executing a living link to Napoleon I would bring, Louis-Philippe simply had the wannabe emperor locked up. But he could afford to be lenient on crazy old Napoleon III in 1840. By that point, the July monarchy was no longer really unpopular. This was more of an accident than any grand plan on Louis-Philippe's part. Between 1840 and 1846, France had experienced an economic boom that hoisted up living standards and kept the middle classes happy. But even during these halcyon days, the warning signs, they were there for the monarchy's future. Louis-Philippe's most important minister was a guy called François Guizot, the conservative iron fist in the king's soft, liberal glove. As the economy boomed, Guizot used precisely none of that money to support the lower classes. Those men and women who'd manned the barricades during the July Revolution, well, they got squat. It wasn't just money they didn't get. Although one of the July monarchy's raison d'etre was to enlarge the franchise that had been so restricted under Charles, voting was still only something that the 1% could do. The rest of the country was starting to wonder why their voices were not being heard. And that's where things were as 1846 rolled into view. The July monarchy was popular-ish, just so long as the good times kept on rolling and no massive shock upset the precarious foundation of sand that Louis-Philippe had built his royal house on. But this is Louis-Philippe we're talking about, the king whose life turned on revolutions. Little did the King of the French know, but he was fast approaching his final one. On January 29, 1848, Alexis de Tocqueville got to his feet in the French Chamber of Deputies and made a prophetic speech. I am told there is no danger because there are no riots. I am told that because there is no visible disorder on the surface of society, there is no revolution at hand. Gentlemen, permit me to say that I believe you are deceived. This is my profound conviction. I believe that we are, at this moment, sleeping on a volcano. It was 2 years on from where we last left Louis-Philippe, hoping the good times would never stop rolling. In fact, they'd not stopped rolling, the entire cart had fallen to pieces. 1846 had seen a major recession hit France, throwing millions out of work. At the same time, a great famine had swept Europe, making life so painful that the decade became known as the Hungry Forties. This was the volcano that Tocqueville was talking about, a France boiling with invisible rage, hidden by a restrictive franchise that locked most people out of power. Only the discontent, it wasn't entirely invisible. The previous year, opposition deputies had begun organizing banquets across France in order to air their grievances. Under the July monarchy, protest was illegal, so private banquets that just happened to feature political speeches were a way around this law. Tens of thousands attended, among them Friedrich Engels of the Communist Manifesto fame. By January 1848, though, the banquet campaign had mostly fizzled out. The organizers decided to put together one last grand one in Paris to cap off the year's work. Only this banquet, it didn't go ahead. Fed up with even this limited freedom of speech, the Guizot government banned it at the last second. This was a big deal. Even under the July monarchy, they had a right to assemble. After some debate, the organizers decided to reschedule for February the 22nd. They would hold a symbolic banquet just to prove that they still had rights and then disperse without making any political speeches. That was how, on February the 22nd, 1848, Paris found itself hosting thousands upon thousands of super-politicized people, angry and primed to believe that cancelling the day's banquet would signal the complete stripping of their rights. If you've watched our other 19th century videos, you may have heard us joke before about how a ban on banquets somehow sparked a revolution in France in 1848. Well, this is how. Faced with all these hostile people right in the heart of Paris, Guizot cancelled the banquet anyway. These hostile people then did what angry hostile people tend to do. Within hours of the cancellation, barricades were springing up across the city. Workers, they were arming themselves. By the morning of February the 23rd, Paris was a gigantic tinderbox. The city was paralyzed by crowds demanding Guizot's head. Terrified by what he had unleashed, Guizot resigned. But then some random soldier decided to throw a match onto the highly combustible situation by opening fire on the crowds that had gathered to hear Guizot's resignation. When the smoke cleared, 52 Parisians were dead. This massacre, well, it caused the volcano to blow its top. By dawn of February the 24th, the French capital, it was out of control. The army was mutinying and the National Guard were joining the revolutionaries. Today, some historians think that if Louis-Philippe had ordered loyal regiments of the army to attack the city, the July monarchy could have survived. But here's the thing about Louis-Philippe. At heart, he wanted to be loved. For all of his faults, this was a man who, when king, had wandered the streets of Paris in a businessman's suit, shaking hands with his subjects. He was ambitious, yes, but he also genuinely believed that he was popular. To cast that last illusion aside by attacking Paris, it was just simply a step too far. That day, February the 24th, 1848, Louis-Philippe abdicated the French crown. At the last moment, he tried to take a leaf from Charles X's playbook and make his grandson king, but what hadn't worked for Charles did not work for Louis-Philippe either. On February the 26th, 1848, with France in revolt, the French monarchy was abolished for good. There would be no more kings, no more queens. The last chapter of the monarchy had ended not in glory, but with Louis-Philippe fleeing into exile. However, there was a postscript. Across Europe, the July monarchy's collapse, it triggered a wave of revolutions. In Austria, Hungary, Italy, and Prussia, old certainties, they were now swept away, and new stories were written. Back in France, the end of Louis-Philippe's story, it wound up being the start of another man's. That's right, it's time for Napoleon III to step back into the spotlight. Within months of Louis-Philippe's fall, the bumbling coup plotter was riding this latest wave of revolution, just as Louis-Philippe had with the July Revolution. On December the 10th, Napoleon III became the first ever president of France. Not 4 years later, he declared himself emperor for life. As Napoleon III was snatching Louis-Philippe's crown, now with extra imperial trimming, the one-time duke was settling into a short, unhappy retirement in England. And we mean short. On August the 26th, 1850, not 3 years after his final revolution, Louis-Philippe passed away. He was 76. So was Louis-Philippe a tyrant, a schemer, or was he just unlucky? Maybe more likely he was just an anachronism, a man who'd decided that he'd one day be king and fulfilled that dream just as France was deciding that it no longer needed a monarchy. Today, the last king of the French is little more than a footnote in history. But we shouldn't let that distract us from the miracle that was Louis-Philippe's turbulent life. He was a man who survived 3 separate French revolutions. 3 times he found himself at the epicenter of European history. In the end, his entire life was perhaps no different from that of the 16-year-old boy that it once been. The boy who leaned out of his window above the Women's March on Versailles, determined to witness history. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do give us a thumbs up below, and don't forget to subscribe. We've got brand new videos just like this several times a week. Also, please do check out our great sponsor, Vincero watches. You will find them below. And as always, thank you for watching.